Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. Welcome to this series, Massey Loves to Read, where we read together interesting book about crucial issues in our society. And today is no exception. We're going to talk about The Crisis in Policing, the new book by John Sewell. Let me first acknowledge that Massey, from where I'm speaking, is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Yonwanda, the Seneca, the Oneechani, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land, as well as the great privilege that we have to do our work here.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Mopetsi. I'm one of the journalism fellows this year at Massey College, and I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this panel about policing in Canada. There are about 70,000 police officers in the country. Police are part of the fabric of everyday life. And for many white Canadians, our expectations about what police do and what values they represent usually goes unchallenged. But of course, expectations about policing will vary greatly depending on the color of your skin, your postal code, and what you do for a living. The Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 were only the most recent movement calling on our political leaders to rethink law enforcement in the country. John Sewell's new book, which he wrote with the research assistant by Christopher Williams, is called Crisis in Canada's Policing: Why Change is So Hard and How Can We Get Real Reform in Our Police Forces. And it arrives at a critical moment in the debate about policing in the country. The book forces us to rethink many of our assumptions about policing. It offers a searing account of the shortcomings of current policing models. It offers explanations about what is preventing change from happening, and it gives us examples about what can be done. John was mayor of Toronto from 1978 to 1980. He chaired the city's housing authority in the 1980s. He wrote for a number of city publications in the 1990s, also while advocating for a long list of municipal issues. In 2000, he helped start the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition. He is a member of the Order of Canada and of the Massey College Quadrangle Society. John, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
So let's get right to it. John, what is the crisis in Canadian policing?
I think the big problem is that the police are a big organization that's rarely talked about in serious fashion, rarely subject to good, objective, and helpful criticism. And it means that it's become really out of touch. It's spending a lot of money, a lot of public money, in ways that are not particularly helpful most of the time. It's become a default mechanism for society. Whenever there's a problem, you phone the police. But in fact, often they're the wrong people to be responding to the kinds of calls that happen. It's a big crisis. It's a very important institution, policing, but we haven't been thinking seriously enough about it, and we need to start rethinking some of the fundamentals of how it's working and why it's working that way and how we can change it so that it's better for everybody.
John, this is not your first book on policing. You have two previous books. Why did you feel the need to write another one, and why now?
Well, I mean, the first book I wrote was almost 40 years ago when I was teaching at York University and needed some kind of book to help me with the course I was teaching in policing. And the last one was more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. This book was written after the murder of George Floyd by the Minnesota police. And what seemed to happen then is there was a big outpouring of concern about police. A lot of demonstrations led by the Black Lives Matter movement, but a lot of other people joined in. And it seemed to me that there was some real opportunity for change. But what I recognized is that a lot of the people who were expressing concerns didn't have much understanding of how police work or what the options for change were, and what the triggers might be of how to get change. And I thought, well, if I can write about them in order to create some clarity around the question of policing, that would help everybody. And it would mean that our chances of actually making the kinds of changes that were needed would be good. Now, of course, what I found is that there hasn't been very much change at all in policing since the murder of George Floyd. There's been talk about it, but in fact, the policing authorities and the politicians responsible for policing haven't made any change. It's still the same old police structure that we've got, and that's across the country. I mean, I wish there was one or two cities I could point to and say, boy, they're really doing something good. Now, there are some places I could point to where some of the police forces are doing better things than other things, but there's no police force that's really, really responded to the challenges that actually exist.
I want to get at the obstacles, these kind of big structural obstacles that you mentioned in the book to real change. But before I get there, one of the lines in the book that really struck me is you say police are not efficient at preventing crime. This is really an arresting statement, I think, for a lot of people in mainstream societies. This is what we expect police are doing all the time. And I think this line is contained in a chapter with the heading, "What do police do?" So before we get into the obstacles to change, I thought maybe I'd get you to talk about this discrepancy between what we think police are doing and what they actually do.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have a real misunderstanding of what police do. I think most people assume that they're involved in stopping crime and so forth. But if you look at the data, in Canada, the average police officer arrests one person per month. That's about 12 people a year. And of those 12 arrests that are made, only 2 concern violence. So to say that the police are big crime fighters, I mean, sorry, it's a very, very small part of their work. And I want to say in a place like Toronto, which has one of the lowest crime rates of any city in Canada, police arrest only 1 person every second month, only 6 people a year. So to say that they're crime fighters is a bit crazy. And in fact, if you look at the calls for service that police get, not very many of them deal with serious violent incidents. In Ottawa, 1 out of every 80 calls for service is considered a priority 1 call, which means that there's some kind of a threat to somebody. 1 out of 80. In Toronto, at the beginning of last year, the first 4 months, the police service had 300,000 calls for service. Of those, only 10,000 involved some kind of violence. So 97% of the calls that police received had nothing to do with any what we call some serious crime. So I what we've got is we got police responding to all sorts of other things. They respond to people who are in mental crisis, and often they're the wrong people to respond. They respond to drug overdoses. They respond to homelessness, and on and on and on. And in fact, having a guy or a woman with body armor and a gun and a taser responding to all those calls that don't involve any of those issues is wrong. It's just the wrong thing. So we've got to start rethinking all that stuff and recognizing that, in fact, they're the wrong people to be dealing with most of the problems that they've been called on to deal with.
Let's take the conversation to the next kind of obvious, the obvious way it needs to go. Okay, so you've outlined a problem, I think. You're not the only one to have outlined the problem. I think at one point in the book, you say one thing we don't need is more studies.
Well, that's right. Just on that point, I mean, I cite about 4 dozen studies that are done by royal commissions and other government bodies, not by academics, but by, they've been commissioned by the government to look at police. And they all basically say the same thing. We got to change. There's too much violence. There's too much racism. There's too much sexism. But in fact, nothing happens, those reports. So thank you very much. Let's put that one on the shelf. It just goes on and on and on. So these are not problems that have just happened since the death of George Floyd. I mean, they've been around for a long, long time. And in fact, the leaders don't get to them. Now, why don't they get to them? Well, I think one of the things is that people are terrified, if you're a political leader or community leader, of being considered soft on crime. Oh, you're criticizing the police? Well, you're being soft on crime. And in fact, police associations, or in some provinces, police unions, really attack people who, in fact, say anything critical about the police. I certainly was subject to that when I was mayor, but lots of other people, politicians and police board members have been subject to the same kinds of pressures. So that's one of the reasons why we never seem to get any debate about policing, any good constructive debate. Sure, there's concern when there's obvious wrongdoing, but in fact, in terms of the normal array of policing issues, we never have any good discussion. I mean, if we've got traffic issues, we get discussion about traffic. If we have land use planning issues, we get lots of public discussion about that. But for policing, which spends a huge chunk of the municipal tax dollar, no discussion at all. It's very, very discouraging.
The term that you use in the book to kind of describe one of the key obstacles here is police culture.
Yeah.
What is police culture? What does it look like, and why is it so? Why is it such an intransigent obstacle to reform?
Yeah. I think we have to realize that many professions have cultures involved in them. We have jokes about dentists and accountants and priests and on and on and on. So because they all have cultures, and the police have a culture too. And the culture of policing is really, really unfortunate. And just how it happens. If you want to become a police officer, you have to go to basically a police college of some sort. Every provincial government has some sort of college where you go to be an officer. You start at the very bottom. You have to go through an interview process before you're accepted as a candidate to go to police college. You then go to the college with other people who want to be police officers. So it's not like a normal college where there's a great array of people around. At that point, you either fit in or you get out. You then get into the police force. You start at the very, very bottom. It doesn't matter whether you got a PhD or any fancy training in criminology. You start out at the bottom and you work your way up through the force. And if in fact you've got problems about the way the force works, you get pushed out, or you say, I can't take this anymore. I just don't like it. And that culture that develops is, first of all, it's very, police support each other. And we've seen this lots and lots of occasions where police actually go on the stand and they say, oh, yes, I saw this happen and this happened. And oh, yes, that officer was really under attack. And then somebody comes up with a video and said, wait a minute now, that's not what happened at all. But police support each other, even if they have to lie. And we've got many, many examples of that across the country. But the other parts of police culture, they're racist. We've seen, it's only now that we're finally getting rid of carding in Canadian police forces, which has been shown over and over and over again in the last 15 or 18 years to discriminate, particularly against Blacks and people who are Indigenous. Very racist. I can't think of any other government bureaucracy that is that imbued with discriminating in terms of race. It's sexist. It really discriminates against women. It hurts them very badly. Women in police forces are constantly complaining. And in fact, there's almost every large police force in Canada is being sued by women officers for the discrimination that they're subject to. And thirdly, there's an awful lot of violence. police seem to cause an awful lot of violence toward people, unnecessary violence, but it happens. And they're the elements of police culture, and they're the things that aren't changing. And when people say they want to reform the police, unless you change that culture, you're in real trouble. And changing that culture involves an awful lot, starting at the top and working down to the bottom.
You mentioned reform, and this was we touched on this earlier today when we spoke, John. But and I want to push you again on it.
Yeah.
Do you think reforming the police is possible, or do you think we need, as a society, to completely reimagine what policing looks like?
I think reform is very difficult and maybe impossible. People always talk about saying, well, let's give police more training. I mean, constantly you hear this from coroner's juries. Oh, if they only had more training on how to deal with the mental health, that'll deal with it. But we've been talking about that for 20 years. And as many people have said, culture eats training for lunch because the culture will always predominate. So I think we've got to start to really rethink it all. Many people have talked about this in terms of defunding. Now, I think a better word on that is de-tasking. Take tasks away from police that we don't need armed people dealing with. The whole question of responding to those in mental health crisis, responding to those with drug overdoses or homeless or even youth. In the United States, I might say they're talking about taking traffic stops away from the police because, of course, traffic stops are often one way in which particularly blacks are extraordinarily discriminated against. So that's one way of actually starting to rethink about the police. Let's get those functions that the police don't need to deal with away from them.
You mentioned the other thing you mentioned to me earlier that I was struck by was you said writing this book was depressing in many ways for you, but at the same time the book ends with a series of very concrete changes that police forces could make. There's some positive examples that you've identified across the country. Maybe if you could walk us through some of these more concrete policy options that our leaders have before them when it comes to reforming police.
Yeah, there are things that could be done that are already being done in Canada that other police forces could adopt. For instance, one of the major complaints in most large cities is that when police are accused of wrongdoing or maybe of a criminal offense, they are suspended with pay. So large police forces are spending millions and millions of dollars a year on officers who've been suspended with pay because they've accused of some sort of wrongdoing. Well, that's a scandal. There's no other municipal or federal or provincial employee who gets suspended and yet still gets fully paid. In Alberta, the chiefs of police there are now allowed to suspend people without pay. Yahoo! It's been going on for 5 years. It works really, really well. There's no great problems with it. If the police union or the police association is unhappy, they file a grievance. That's fine. Justice happens in other lines of work. So that's one change that could easily be made. It would save an awful lot of money, and it would help to get rid of that awful odor of suspending somebody and then fully paying them. I mean, in places like Toronto, you have people who've been suspended with pay for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. And just as a final decision is coming out on their appeal or whatever, they resign from the police force, taking all that money with them. So that's one kind of a change that could easily be made. Another change is the whole idea of pre-charge screening. So that instead of police officers laying charges, you'd have to have the police officer go to a Crown attorney and get the Crown attorney to lay the charge. So the Crown attorney could vet the charge to see how reasonable it was. The Crown attorney could also take a look at the racial implications of the charges that are being laid, because, as we know, Blacks and Indigenous people are charged 5 or 7 or 8 times more than whites, and that's true generally in most cities in Canada. So if you actually had pre-charge screening, you'd make a big change. And here's the change. In Ontario, about half the charges that are laid by police are withdrawn or they're dismissed by the court. Half. In Toronto, that figure actually is more than 2/3 of all the charges laid by police are withdrawn or rejected by the courts. Ontario doesn't have pre-charge screening, but Quebec has pre-charge screening, and in that case, only 10% of the charges are dismissed or rejected by the court. British Columbia has pre-charge screening, and there 18% of the charges are rejected by the courts or withdrawn. So clearly, if you had pre-charge screening, you'd be saving a lot of court time, you'd be saving a lot of police time, and a lot of those people who are unnecessarily charged would not be harassed. So that's another change that could easily be made. It makes the police more efficient, just like the idea of saying you can suspend somebody without pay. They're too charged. Let me give you one further change that could be made. If you want to break police culture, a good way of doing it is bringing people in from the outside. Bringing people in senior positions from the outside who can start to question exactly how things are done. The chief of police in Edmonton, Chief Lakey, has now brought in 2 deputy chiefs from the outside. They have no previous police experience. This is a really big and useful change. It's something that other big police forces should be doing as well. So there are 3 things where we've already got examples of how effective they are that should be done across the country.
If you're just joining us, the book is Crisis in Canada's Policing. The author is John Sewell. We're quite fortunate at this moment to have two experts in this area who are going to come join us now in the broadcast. We have Abby Deshman, who's a lawyer and is the interim executive director and director of the criminal justice program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And her recent work has really focused on bail system and police record checks. Abby, thanks so much for joining us. And we also have with us Alex Luscombe, who's a PhD candidate and the Center of Criminology and Sociological Studies at the University of Toronto, and he's an alumnus of Massey College. He specializes in the areas of policing studies, information politics, and computational methodology. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to kind of start off with a question for all 3 of you guys, and it's kind of based on an observation that many have made over the weekend, based on the Freedom Convoy that made its way to Ottawa. The Ottawa police this weekend they put out a statement saying they were going to refrain from issuing tickets to those taking part in the protests, that they were opting for a tactic of de-escalation. And many have pointed out that police don't seem to use this tactic of de-escalation when protesters are Indigenous, defending the sovereignty of their land, or when the protesters are Black activists demanding social justice. We'll start with you, Alex, and then we'll kind of move across the board. Is this a legitimate observation, and what is behind any asymmetry in police response to these kinds of protest movements?
Yeah, I think that was kind of my reaction to reading about that as well. And what came to mind is the kind of insurrectionists that stormed the Capitol in the U.S., right? And people had similar kinds of comments where they said, the police seem to be kind of just letting them do their thing, and this is clearly not how they respond to Indigenous protests around environmental issues, Black Lives Matter protests, etc. And so, I think it is kind of very similar to that here, and it sends a message to people that police are going to kind of treat, these kinds of predominantly white movements differently than they're going to treat protests that are kind of more racialized, that involve Indigenous, Black people, etc., protesting things that perhaps the police aren't as much in agreement with. Right, I'm thinking of that video where the police car kind of drove by and put the thumbs up to the protesters in the convoy. So that's what I have to say on that. I'll pass it on to Abby.
Abby, what's your take on this perceived asymmetry?
Yeah, it's not just a perceived asymmetry. I think it is an asymmetry. And, when I talk to police officers that make operational decisions about how to deal with protests, part of it is on the ground, reality assessment for them. There are, tens of thousands of people at this particular protest. And if we start issuing tickets, we're vastly outnumbered. And if things get violent, we don't have the resources to deal with that. But the way that operational reality gets filtered out is if you are in a smaller group, if you are in a minority group that has, very low population numbers, if you are fighting larger powers, you are not going to get the benefit of that police treatment because they will have the numbers to be able to really come in, arrest you, and completely eliminate your protest. So it is a operational response that has obvious political consequences about who gets the benefit of our rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And it's, trying to get police to realize that they have a political role, right? They're all of their actions. And this comes back to some of John's very good points about discretion. How do they exercise discretion? What's informing that? What are the biases that come in, the operational realities, the lessons that they've been taught that help inform their exercise of discretion? And all of those have social context and histories of colonialism and discrimination that come in and layer on top of it. And this is a really concrete example of that. But trying to get police to realize how this social context informs and directly impacts their day-to-day operations is a real challenge.
John, what were your takeaways from the Ottawa Police's decision to de-escalate this weekend?
Well, I agree with what both Alex and Abby have said. My impression is that I like the idea that police decide that their job is to keep order rather than trying to arrest people all over the place. So I like that approach. And I wish they'd extend that to those other situations that Abby was talking about, particularly, when there's Aboriginal people, as an example, trying to defend their forests and stuff. I think the job of the police is to keep order rather than to try and make arrests and say, oh, we're enforcing the law. But again, we're into police culture again. I mean, that's not the way that the police respond to these kinds of issues, and that's the problem. It'd be very nice, by the way. It'd be very nice if policing authority started to address this question. Police boards, as an example, started to say, "Hey, hold on a second." So when in fact, the police are trying to evict people from parks in Toronto, which they were doing this summer. I mean, with just extraordinary amounts of money being spent to evict a dozen people from a park. I think, the board should have been saying, hey, we want our police to keep order rather than to go in and do these awful arrests.
I want to hold that thought just for a moment, John. And encourage anyone in our audience who has questions to put them in the comment section. We're going to get to them in just a few minutes. So take some time to think of some hard questions for our crack panelists here. John, you mentioned accountability, and one of the themes in the book is the weakness of accountability mechanisms. And if I can, I'd like to hear both Alex and Abby on this as well. And Abby, we'll start with you, given your kind of position at the CCLA. What is your what is your perception of the strength of the accountability mechanisms in place in Canada?
I mean, it's really a continued struggle. It has been for decades now. It was a fight to get any amount of civilian independent oversight into policing, and now it is a fight to make those mechanisms effective enough so that they actually have some teeth, and they can not only recognize wrongs when they happen, but actually have a remedy that impacts things for the people who are involved and moving forward. It's part of this again comes back to some just systemic barriers about how we view police officers, the weight that their word has in the justice system, and then again another part of it is how insular, both legally and culturally, the institution of policing is. It's very, very difficult to make inroads into that command structure. So all of those things stack up against really effective oversight and accountability for the police. Interesting areas, I think, that should be explored is thinking about a college of policing. It's not something that we talk about a lot, but there are lots of professions that are regulated by colleges, and that's separate from your job. And right now we've merged jobs and professionalism into one, and it makes for a very difficult oversight job.
Alex, a lot of your work involves data. You're a data guy. When we have these conversations about accountability, where's the data component of that? How do you see that playing out in terms of the basic information that we have available of how policing operates in Canada? Oh, Alex, I think you're on mute, Alex. I think he's making an excellent point. I can see it in his hand signals. So while we kind of figure out what's going on with Alex, John, I'll throw it to you. Like I was mentioning at the top of this question, a big part of your book is about these accountability mechanisms, kind of the weakness of these accountability mechanisms.
Yeah.
Why are they so weak? And Abby had a very interesting proposal to make them stronger with a kind of potential college of police. But what's your take on that?
Well, I would start with police boards. Police boards in Canada are very, very weak. Some of them are structured, so they're weak. Others are not structured, so they're weak, but the members they get on there refuse to raise any serious questions about what's going on. I mean, I use the example of in the book about the Toronto Police Service Board. In 2001, the Supreme Court of Canada came out with a decision that said, look at Toronto Police, you're doing far too many strip searches. Strip searches are demeaning and they're degrading. You should be doing a pat-down search first, and we think that's something you should be doing. And the Toronto Police Board said, oh, thank you very much. We appreciate your advice. We're going to continue right on. And every year since then, in 2001, our group, the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition, has gone before the police board and saying, you're doing too many strip searches. And every year the Toronto Police Board says, oh, well, thank you very much, Mr. Sewell. We're just going to continue right on. Until 2017, 2018, the Ontario Police Review Director did a report about strip searches in Ontario. It looked at large police forces, and it said that most large police forces in Ontario are strip searching 1% of the people who are arrested. Toronto strip searches 40% of the people who are arrested, 40 times higher than, say, Ottawa or Kingston or London. And the Toronto Police Board, believe it or not, said, thank you very much. We're just going to continue on. It wasn't until 2019, that's 19 years later, that the police service said, oh, we're going to change the number of strip searches we do, and we're going to start to do pat-down searches first. And at that point, the Toronto Police Board said, oh, okay, we'll make the change. 19 years. I mean, this is no accountability at all. And I might say that I don't think the Toronto Police Services Board is much different than many other police boards across the country. They simply don't do their job. And both municipal governments and provincial governments don't appoint people to those boards who are going to stand up and say good, strong stuff. And that's a problem. I mean, there are a bunch
Alex,
of other accountability mechanisms that I could get into that review police actions, and they're equally, toothless.
Alex, it's
now
good
I
to
want to
see
hear
you.
Alex, though.
Yeah, let's. Alex, what do you have to say? Well, you're back. It's good to see you back.
Yeah.
I threw a question to you about.
Yeah, sorry, I think I may
data.
have had a large cloud.
So what were you trying to get across with those energetic hand signals about accountability, and particularly the data piece of accountability?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of access to more data about policing, especially for people on the outside, researchers, right, independent people who can kind of evaluate and study how policing is operating. Something that John talks a lot about in the book. At the same time, I don't think that just giving us access to data would be a solution for many of the problems that John talks about. In the United States, they've got kind of far greater access to criminal justice data across the board, but of course, many of the same problems of violence, sexism, racism, lack of oversight, et cetera, continue to persist south of the border. So, certainly, access to data is not a kind of solution in and of itself, but it's something that we do need. I think that kind of keeps these conversations going and allows us to kind of properly and evaluate how policing is working on an ongoing basis. But of course, police in Canada make it extremely hard to access the data that researchers often want, right? Abby and I did some work together on how police were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and something that we wanted was information about the demographic characteristics of the people that they were giving fines to, right? We wanted to kind of determine, was it predominantly racialized people, for example, that police were giving these tickets to, as we had seen in New York City and London, England, other places, right? Journalists had already documented this, and agencies like the Toronto Police and Toronto Bylaw came out and said, we're not going to collect any of that information with respect to the policing of COVID. This is not even going to exist, right? So you have things like that which just happen in Canada, and it makes it extremely hard as a kind of observer or researcher to just answer these basic questions that people can answer in other places. And I think on the problem of oversight, it's also important that like oversight mechanisms themselves, although they're not great in Canada, they're not very effective, but like accessing data about oversight is also really hard. The oversight mechanisms themselves make it really, really difficult to get data on what they're doing. And just lastly on this point, I just point out that like it's not only that we have kind of ineffective oversight mechanisms with respect to police, we also have law enforcement agencies like the CBSA that don't have any oversight mechanisms, right? They have no independent oversight. And in Ontario, you have things like special constables, which operate completely outside of police oversight mechanisms. They're outside of the jurisdiction of the SIU, and so there's a lot of problems with respect to both data and oversight.
I want to switch to the Q&A part of our discussion. If you have questions, just fire them in the comments section, and we'll get to them. I know this may be cheating somewhat, but I know Alex has a question for John. And so while we give people a chance to think about what questions they want to ask our guests, Alex, why don't I start with you and give you the platform and give you the chance to ask a question to John.
Yeah, sure. So I think John answered a lot of them in the questions you had already asked. I guess my questions weren't that original. So they've kind of been answered in a way, but I can ask one of them. One thing I was wondering about, I really enjoyed reading the book, and it does this fantastic job of talking about how police culture, police management, and training structures, and unions, and associations, and everything else, act as a kind of barrier to change and a barrier to reform. And that's very much the objective of the book, and it succeeds. But I'm also wondering about the role of institutions that are kind of adjacent to the police, the media, politicians, legislators, et cetera. Maybe this is the subject of your next book, but what kind of role do they play in kind of inhibiting reform and change, right? Like there's people who argue that journalists are often too descriptive and don't kind of do enough to talk about the kind of structural issues in policing, or people who say that kind of legislators, kind of lack imagination, and when they are faced with some social problem, they just say, "Well, we'll just create a new responsibility and give it to the police." So what's your kind of where do these other kinds of institutions outside of the police kind of fit within your perspective of police and the kinds of difficulties we have in reforming them?
Well, there's no question that these institutions could play a very useful role, and they don't play much of a role. Thinking of the media as an example, the media is not particularly strong about giving useful perspectives about police. They deal with police wrongdoing, and when that happens, often the media jumps in and there's some interviews back and forth and so forth. But there's no good critical take on things on a continuing basis. And I think that's a problem. That would help us deal with it. I think the media has gotten more interested in issues relating to racial and sexual discrimination. They're dealing with that. And they could be more focused on it when it comes to policing. And maybe that will happen. Legislators, in my opinion, totally missed the mark. I'm just appalled that so few legislators are actually concerned about what goes on. I mean, I mentioned the example of strip searches in Toronto, and it took us 19 years to actually get some change after the Supreme Court decision. Our group, even though it went every year to the police board asking for change in strip searches, could never get any member of city council to come and join us and agree to ask for that. So legislators are not good at all. And in many cases, they're going in the opposite direction. I mean, here's the Premier of Ontario continually doling out money to police, arguing that police funds are always being cut. Well, of course, it's not true. They're always being increased more than any other municipal expenditure item. So they're both areas where we could have some good, serious change. Be nice to get some legislators who decided they were actually going to stand up for some good, serious efficiencies in policing. Although the cost for that is that they'll be accused of being soft on crime. But change can't happen. I mean, the minister of, or the Attorney General in Ontario in 2016 brought in a law that prohibited carding in Ontario. And in fact, that law is in place and it's worked really, really well. And although Yazir Nafki, he didn't get reelected the last provincial election, I don't think he got attacked because he brought in that law. So there are some examples where politicians do make the right move and manage to survive doing it. We need more politicians doing that.
We have a question from one of our audience members. Kash Maharaj asks, yes, almost all federal ministers have denounced carding as racist while refusing to end it in the RCMP. Ministers seem to expect political gain from talking about police reform, but not from acting. Why? John, I'll let you take a first crack at that question.
Well, I guess at the federal level, there's two reasons. One is that the person who's mostly been in charge of the RCMP is Bill Blair, the former chief of police in Toronto. He's just endued in police culture. And, he did nothing to try and stop carding in Toronto, so he's not going to try and stop it anywhere else. So that's one reason. But I think the second reason, and I've already mentioned it, is that if you're a political leader and you talk about change in policing, you get attacked by police associations and police unions. You get attacked very, very strongly. And that has happened generally across the country. Certainly when politicians talked about reducing funding by detasking police, taking functions out of the police, the people who did that in virtually every city in Canada was attacked by the police association. So I think that's why, carding has not stopped in the RCMP, just as other things have not stopped in the RCMP. We don't have effective governance of the RCMP.
Abby, what's what's the CCLA's relationship with police, and specifically, do you ever notice any pushback from them when the organization tries to make them accountable for any misdeeds that may have occurred?
Yeah, I mean, it's complex. We are, our mandate is to look at and ensure that governments are respecting people's rights, and the police are in mandate a lot. The most clear example of this complex interaction is actually, for me, the work we did around the G20 protests in Toronto, and so we were extremely critical right out of the gate of the massive arrests that took place during that protest in 2010 in Toronto, and after that, we received an enormous amount of pushback from the police, but it wasn't universal. I can remember I was a program director in the aftermath of that, and I was invited by the Toronto Police to come and speak to all of their public order unit officers. It was a difficult series of rooms. So there is, it is mixed. There are people in the police who we are able to have conversations with, and they're constructive conversations, and they're interesting conversations, and they open up space for dialogue and for change, I'd say. But then there is the monolith of the institution and the culture. And one of the real tensions in doing this work and doing, being a critical voice against the police is to try and figure out, when are those conversations worth engaging in, and when are you going to be co-opted, right? When are you going to be supporting the continuation of an institution and really papering over some very, very deep and long-standing flaws by, engaging in more dialogue, engaging in joint processes. And that's a really, really difficult call to make.
Alex, you're an academic, obviously. What to what degree is there any openness on the part of police departments, police officers themselves, to being studied by the academic community?
Yeah, I think it's really hit and miss. I think there's some people who have really strong relationships with police, and they're able to get kind of, more or less unfettered access, but it tends to be that they ask kind of certain questions or kind of operate within certain parameters that the police perhaps prefer. And I think, that's something that interesting that comes out in John's book, is that he draws on summarizes really nicely a couple of studies by Richard Erickson from the kinds of 1970s, 1980s. And that was a kind of crucial turning point in Canadian criminology, when he had conducted, it's called ethnographic studies, where he's observing police kind of in action, going in the patrol cars, watching them do their work in their offices. He did two major studies, one on a detective unit appeal, one on a kind of patrol unit, two of which John talks about in the book. And, those were very controversial studies. One of them resulted in the police department suing the department that Richard Erickson was working for, to try to stop the book from being published, largely because he had found things about detectives engaging in various kinds of misconduct, not kind of doing as much crime fighting and doing more paperwork than they kind of wanted to be depicted doing publicly. And, it was very controversial. And I think, a lot of people see that as a kind of crucial turning point in Canadian criminology, when police departments became a little more careful about the kinds of researchers that they were going to let in, the kinds of research that they were going to enable, because, they saw that there were kind of PR repercussions for letting more critical people inside.
And what's interesting, Alex, is that Those studies that Erickson done have never been repeated, and they're almost 50 years old. The studies of actually what police officers do, how they spend their time, and what detectives do. And what Erickson found was that on an average shift, officers would respond to 1 or 2 calls per shift, which is still the situation in Canada. Officers respond to 1 or 2 calls for every shift. Well, it would be really good to get somebody to start doing those studies again, but I'm not aware of any police board and any police service that said, oh yeah, let's do a study of what actually police do and how they spend their time, or in fact, how detectives do. I mean, I think Alex is dead right on that, but those studies, Erickson was so strong on those studies that in fact, the police said, we aren't doing those again, thank you very much. And they've maintained that for 4 decades.
We've got, I think we've got time for one more question, and it's kind of a two-parter. It begins with I think an important observation from the ARV 268, who notes the representation of this panel. We're 4 white people, and obviously we're not of the race that is primarily the victim of police violence, and I think that's an important point to note. The ARP 268 goes on to ask a question to all of us, and I'll put it to you, John, first, and then we can kind of go through Abby and Alex to see what their take on this is. But the ARP notes that one of the greatest barriers to reform has been the police union. Can we ever get rid of them? John, how do you respond to that?
I'm not sure we can get rid of them, but what we can do is we can try and balance the relationship of power in the situation. I mean, one of the suggestions I make is the idea that we should stop giving police full pay while they're suspended. One of the problems with giving them full pay when they're suspended is not only the public money involved, but it means that they have no interest in trying to get a fast hearing on their case, or stopping appeals on it. They will drag it out as long as possible. And police unions, police associations help them do that, providing lawyers who will provide that for them. And if we actually said, sorry, we aren't paying you when you're suspended, I think that would substantially reduce the amount of police pressure, police association pressure. And that would be a really, really good thing. I mean, let's face it, everybody has a chance to be organized into a union or an association, but I think we've got to give make sure that the powers of that association or union are relatively reasonable. And so that would be one change I think that we could make for the better.
Abby, coming from somebody who's at a civil liberties association, how do you respond to calls to abolish or get rid of or dramatically limit the powers of police unions and police associations?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, because we are a civil liberties association, we are focused on all the rights, and that includes freedom of association, which is a core labor right. So, there are reasons why some labor associations, some unions look different from others, and sometimes that is about balancing power. But I think, as John said, getting rid of associations and unions in all forms in policing would be quite difficult. And probably not something that we would support. I do just want to thank the ARV for calling attention to the lack of diversity on the panel. And I think it points to one of the key missing elements in policing reform, which has been, support for and really making space for social movements to come forward. A lot of the movement that we have seen, the public awareness that has been generated in the past past years has been because communities have stood up and come together and marched on the streets. And I don't think that, we would be having the types of conversations that we are having today in the public sphere, at least, if it weren't for those communities that are most directly impacted by police violence, if it weren't for those communities standing up and speaking out. So I think it behooves us all, certainly it behooves the CCLA, to pay attention and to make sure that we are standing in support of communities and really taking the lead from the communities and thinking about, how can you do reform in a meaningful way, and letting that meaningfulness being defined by communities is really important.
And Alex, we'll throw it over to you. Abby raises some really interesting points there. I'll let you touch on those if you'd like, or if you just want to talk about police unions and how they intersect with academic research. We've kind of been focused so much on police forces per se, but clearly police unions play a big role any time where we have conversations about reform in policing.
Yeah, I'll start by also thanking the RF268 for the comment about representation, because I think it's an important one, and they're 100% right. I agree. And I think, on that point, and building on what Abby was saying, something that police departments often say, when there is conversation about defunding or abolition or whatever it is, they often say, well, what's the alternative, right? Well, what are they supposed to do? If you're not using police to respond to homelessness, then what exactly are you going to do? And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of, grassroots organizations already exist. And there's a lot of activist movements that are active, that are experts on the alternatives that already exist, just at a smaller, kind of more local scale, are already working. And so I think, it's like Abby said, consulting these groups, carving out much more space for them to kind of advise politicians, et cetera, on the directions that policing reform should happen, is something that needs to be done. And I think, when we say, well, what's the alternative? Well, there is no alternative. I mean, that's basically just showing that we're not talking to the groups that already know what the alternatives are, which are usually groups made up of the people who, deal with the lived realities of police violence and harm, and have already come up with, solutions that could be scaled up. And I think on the point of unions, that for me was something that was so interesting about John's book, because police unions and associations, as far as I know as an academic, it's got to be one of the most under-researched, understudied, underwritten about aspects of Canadian policing. I can think of a book by a historian about the history of police associations, and I can think of John's book, which talks about police associations, and a colleague, Jamie Duncan, my department, has written something as well. But apart from those studies, there isn't much. And so I think paying attention to police unions and associations and the role that they play as kind of barriers to reform is extremely important, and we need more of it. We need to kind of put the spotlight on them, just to kind of study them, write about them, and bring them into the conversation, because clearly they play a huge role as kind of a structural barrier for change.
Alex, thanks so much for that. That's Alex Luscombe, PhD candidate at U of T. Abby Deshman, thank you so much, both of you, for helping us have a really fascinating conversation about John's book. The book, again, Crisis in Canada's Policing. It's really a fascinating read. It should be on the desk of every journalist in the country. That's my personal personal pitch. You can buy the book wherever good books are sold. John has a great website, johnsewell.ca. John, thank you for joining us. Thank you for letting us celebrate the publication of this book.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Alex. It was really enjoyable. I enjoyed it. Thank you.